Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah. Here we're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, and we will be learning today Mirz Hashem Daf Nun Amid Beis. We have to complete Daf Nun Amid Beis as well as Nun Aleph Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Tefillin. We find ourselves in the midst of Siman Lamed Beis, a very complex Siman detailing many of the issues that can come up when writing Tefillin in the formation and the writing of the parshiyos, etc., etc. So we find ourselves today on Nun Amid Beis, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 lines down, Siman Lamed Beis, Sif Lamed Beis. Says the Mechaber, Tzarech lahaniach chalak lamayla. We need to leave an empty space at the top of the parsha. So when we're writing the Tefillin, we need an empty space at the top of the cloth, above the uppermost line of writing, Kidei Gaga Shel Lamed. And that empty space has to have enough room so that you could write the upper part of a Lamed. The top of the Lamed extends above the line. What happens if on the very first line of the writing you have to write a Lamed? So you have to have enough room on top of that line to allow for the top of the Lamed. Not only does it have to allow for the top of the Lamed, but the top of the Lamed cannot reach the actual edge of the cloth because it has to be mukaf gvil. It has to be surrounded by blank parchment. Therefore, we have this halacha that at the top, we need to leave a space over the uppermost line that has enough room to make the upper part of a Lamed and to have a tiny bit of space above it, so it should be mukaf gvil, as the Ramah says right away, Haga sheyu gam heim mukafim gvil, so that if you have to write a Lamed, the top of the Lamed should also be mukaf gvil. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Kuf Lamed Tes, Lamayla. What does the Mechaber mean when he says Lamayla, above? He means mehashitais, above all of the lines on the cloth, above the uppermost line, Kidei Gaga Shalamed, so that you have an amount of space where you could write the top of the Lamed. Venerally, the Chavetz Chaim says, it appears to me, Dahainu Miksav Beinoni. How large does this have to be? You could write a Lamed many different sizes. So what does it mean, the size of the uppermost part of a Lamed? Is it a font size 12? Is it a font size 8? Is it a font size 16? What size Lamed is it? Says the Chavetz Chaim, it would appear to him that we're talking about an average ksav. Afilu hu kaisev rak ksav katan. So, even if the Sefer happens to be writing a very small parsha, he's writing parshiyos for very small tefillin. So he's writing in a very, very small ksav. Still, the amount of space that you need above the top line of the ksav, it's not proportionate to the size of the writing that he's doing. It's a ksav beinoni. No matter what size you are writing, the amount of space you need to leave over the above the uppermost line is the size that it would take to write the upper part of a lamed in a ksav beinoni. I'm not going to go into what the Mishnah Berurah writes in the brackets over here because it's a little bit complex and it's really not necessary for the topic at hand. So let's go back now to the Shulchan Aruch. We go now 4 lines up from the bottom after the Ramah, where now the Mechaber is going to tell us how much space do we need to leave beneath the bottom line of the writing. Says the Mechaber, ulamata, and then below, underneath the bottommost line, Kishir Kaf V'Nun Pshuta. You have to leave enough space under the bottom line. So if you have a Chaf Seifis or a Nun Seifis, these are letters that extend underneath the line. You have to have enough room to be able to make those long letters. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Kuf Mem Pshuta. This is the Chaf Seifis or the Nun Seifis. So you have to have enough room beneath so you could write those letters. Says the Chavetz Chaim, V'oid mashahu. It's not enough to have an exact amount of space for that letter. You have to have an additional mashahu, additional minute amount of space. Why? Because like I said earlier, you can't write the Chaf Pshuta or the Nun Pshuta all the way down to the bottommost edge of the cloth because it has to be mukaf gvil. So both in the case of the lamed, the amount of space you need above the uppermost line and the amount of space you need beneath the bottommost line, you have to have enough room so that you could extend these long letters either upward or downward, and then have a minute amount of space above them till the edge of the parchment, so that they should all be mukaf gevil. The rationale for all of this, the Mishnah Berurah continues, is kedei, in order, shekeshe yizdarmid lo lekasvam, so that if you have a lamid on the uppermost line, or you have a chaf pshuta or a nun pshuta on the bottommost line, sheyeh lo makom lazeh, you should have adequate space to write the letter properly. There are those that say there are those that say that it's not that you have to have enough room for the top part of the lamid or the bottom part for the chaf pshuta or the nun pshuta, and then a mashahu to make sure that there's room for it to be mukaf gvil. There's an actual measurement, and that measurement is chatzi tzipiren, half of the size of a fingernail. And the Mishnah Berurah concludes Eis Katan Kuf Mem, and he says V'zer rak lechatchila. However, that measurement of chatzi tzipiren is only lechatchila. Okay, now let's go weiter in the Mishnah Berurah. Again, we're 4 lines up, a little bit past the halfway mark in the line. Says the Mechaber, we have now covered how much space you need to leave on top, how much space you need to leave on bottom. Now the Mishnah Berurah addresses the question of the margins on the left and the right. Says the Mechaber, ubetchilasan v'saifan, as far as the beginning of the line, the right margin, v'saifan, or the end of the line on the left margin, ein tzarech lahniach klal, you don't have to leave any space at all. However, says the Mishnah Berurah right away, nice cut and kuf mem aleph, klal, you don't have to leave any space at all. That's not precise. Rak mashahu, you definitely do have to leave a mashahu, at least a tiny, minute amount of space before the beginning of the line or after the end of the line, la kafas gvilam, because you can't write the letters all the way to the edge of the parchment. They are required to be mukaf gevil. Continues the Shulchan Aruch 4 lines up at the end of the line, Haga. Says the Rambam, Mihu. Despite the fact that the Mechaber just said that betchilasan v'saifan, at the beginning of the lines and at the end of the lines, ein tzarech laniach klal, says the Rambam, Mihu, nagu ha-seifrim, it is the minig of the seifrim, laniach ksas betchila v'saif, to leave a little space both before the beginning of the line and after the end of the line. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut kuf ben beis, ktsas, a small amount of space, hainu ktsas yoiser mehakafas gevil. In the previous Mishnah Berurah, we already learned that you must leave at least a tiny amount because you need the letters to be mukaf gevil. Now, when the Ramah says that the meaning of the seifrim is to leave a makom ktsas, he means ktsas yoiser mehakafas gevil, a minute amount more than what would be necessary for hakafas gevil. Now he says, V'yesh machmirin, there are those that rule stringently, and they are machmir, the lechatchila tzarech betchila, that lechatchila, at the beginning of the line, you need an amount of empty space, kedei ligloil kol haparsha, so that you have enough empty klaf before the beginning of the line, so that that empty amount, when you roll up the parsha, the empty space should be able to wrap around the parsha. K'moy mezuzah, like we find the halacha by mezuzah, that you're supposed to have at the beginning of the line enough empty klaf to wrap around the circumference of the rolled up klaf when you roll it up. We saw a similar halacha when we learned the halachas of Megillah. Now let's go weiter here in the Ramah. 3 lines up, a little bit past the middle of the line, says the Ramah, V'tzarech lahaniach ben kol teva v'teva kimaloi ois. Between each word, you have to leave an empty space equal to the size of 1 ois. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ois kofem gimel ois, which ois? Says the Mishnah Berurah, kitana, a small ois, shehu yud. Since it doesn't tell us which ois, there are bigger oisi ois and there are smaller oisi ois, it just says to leave an ois, we assume an ois kitana, the smallest ois, which is a yud. So between each word, you need a space where you could fit in a yud. But the Mishnah Berurah says, ubediyeved, ein lifsarel, we're not going to pass all the tefillin, ela imke nireis kiteva achas, letinoik doloichakim veloy tipesh. So let's say you're looking at a parsha of tefillin, and you see that the space between two words does not look like enough room to leave a yud. What's the absolute minimum gap that you need to have between two words? It has to be that if a tinoik, a child who is lechakim v'leitipesh, not too sharp and not too simple, he'll look at it, and if he realizes that it's two words, if he notes that there's a separation, and that separation to the tinoik is enough that he recognizes that it's two separate words, then it's okay. But if a tinoik thinks that it's one word, then you have a problem. Says the Rama weiter. Second line from the bottom, beginning of the line. V'chein bein hashitim, between each line, kimaloi shita, you need to leave an amount of space equal to a line. So you write a line, and then you skip a gap the size of a line, and then you write the next line. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kof Mem Dalet Shita. There are those that say that you do not need a gap between the lines equal to the written lines, only by a Sefer Torah. And the Mishnah Berurah says that the Sefer Matakter are not medaktik to leave an empty space the size of a shita. There is a footnote in the Dirshu Mishnah Berurah, I don't have it in front of me right now, where he brings down, I believe, not from the Kesas HaSefer, I think from the Sefer Lishkas HaSeferim, he brings down that the Seferim are careful to leave space between the shitas, because if you don't leave adequate space between the lines, you could start running into a problem. Let's remember the halacha that we learned previously. If the upper part of a lamid enters the airspace of an ois on the line above, or the bottom part of a chaf pshuta or a nun pshuta enters the airspace of a letter on the line below, like let's say it goes into the upper opening of a test, you could run into problems. And this is why we need to leave adequate space between the lines. So far we have covered over here empty space above the top line, empty space beneath the bottom line, empty space on the right margin, empty space on the left margin, empty space between each word, empty space between each line. Now the Ramah says, second line from the bottom, ubein kol ois, how much space is there supposed to be between one letter and the next letter in the same word? How much space should there be? Says the Ramah, kimaloi chot hasaira, it should be a very thin gap, like a hair. K'moi b'Sefer Torah, which is the halacha that we see by a Sefer Torah, u'k'moi sheyispar b'tur Yeridea, like it is learnt, like it is recorded in Yeridea in Hilchos Sefer Torah. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Cotton Kuf Mem Hey, chut hasaira, there's supposed to be a hair's breadth gap between the letters of the same word. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this requirement is only lechatchila, that it should be so tight that there should only be a gap of a chut hasaira. That's only a requirement lechatchila. Aval b'diavad ein lifsoil b'diavad. If there's a larger gap than a chut hasaira, we're not going to make it puzzle ela im kein niras hateva chaluka l'shtayim, unless it looks like now it's two separate words. If the word looks like there's a gap in the middle of the word so that it looks like two separate words, then it would be puzzle. Ukabaisha dispar kol zebi yeridea b'simin reish ayin dalad le'inyan sefer Torah. Finally, let's conclude Sif Lamed Beis, bottom line in the Ramah. Gam tzarach lahaniach ma'at chalak bein pasuk lepasuk. You should also leave a little bit of a gap between the last word of one pasuk and the first word of the next pasuk. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kat Kuf Mem Vav, Ma'at Chalak, Aval Magen Avram b'Shem Kama Achrayim v'Hagra b'Biyurai Hichriu. You have a Magen Avram in the name of many Achrayim, and the Gra and the Bir Hagra Hichriu. They conclude and they rule the Ein Tzarich Laniach Chalak Yoiser Mi Bein Teva LeTeva beEmtza pasuk, that you don't have to leave any additional blank space between, you don't have to leave any more blank space between the last word of a pasuk and the first word of a pasuk than you do between any other two words in middle of a pasuk. Now we go to Sif Lamed Gimel. Says the Mechaber, final word on Nun Amid Beis, Sif Lamed Gimel. Yaseh Hashurais Shavos. The lines should be evenly justified. So anybody who's used to using a word processor nowadays, you use Microsoft Word, or if you're an Apple person and you use Pages, there's always a setting where you could set how the lines should be justified. That means, should they be even at the end of the line or not? Says the Mechaber over here, Yasa Hashurais Shavos, the lines should be made even. Shalaitei achas nichneses va'achas yoitzeis. We should not have uneven margins on the right and the left, so that words go in, words go out, there's indents and out. No, they should be evenly justified on the two sides. Ulapachais, and at least Yizayar, you should take care, shalayichtov shalosh oisiyos chutz lashita, that you should not write 3 letters extending out to the side beyond the margin. So you don't want to go out beyond the left margin more than 3 letters. V'im kisavam, however, if you did write letters outside of the margin, loy pasal, we're not going to say it's pasal. Now really, maybe I should have read this to you beforehand. This is based on a Gemara in Menachos on Daf Lamed Amid Aleph, and I have to tell you that this is a very shvera sugya with a complex machlokes rishonim that is way beyond the scope of this shir. But at least I'll just tell you what the Gemara in Menachos says. The Gemara in Menachos says, the bottom of Lamed Amid Aleph, Nizdamno loy teva bas chamesh oisiyos. Let's say you get to the end of the line, and at the end of the line you're up to a word that has 5 letters. I'm just thinking, ukishartam vav kuf shin reish taf mem. Now that's 6 letters. So let's say you have a word, you come to a word that's a 5-letter word, and you're at the end of the line. Nizdamno loy teva bas chamesh oisiyos. You have a word that is 5 letters. Lo yichtov shtayim b'soich hadaf. Do not write 2 letters within the margins. V'shalosh chutz ladaf, and then have 3 letters outside the margin, because you can't go to the next line. You have to finish the word. You've got a 5-letter word. Don't write 2 letters within the margin and then have 3 letters extending outside the margin. Ella, rather, what should you do? Shalosh b'soich hadaf. You should make sure that you get 3 letters within the margin. Ushtayim chutz ladaf, and then have 2 letters outside the margin. Then the Gemara says, Nizdamna loy teva bashtei oisiyos. Let's say you get up to a word that has 2 letters, shel, loy. So you get to a word that is 2 letters, a 2-letter word. Loy yizrekena lebein hadafin. Don't extend that word outside of the column, so that it is, in the words of the Gemara, lo yizrekena, do not cast it lebein hadafin, to the area that's between the columns. In other words, you have a 2-letter word, do not write an entire 2-letter word outside of the lines. Ella chayza v'kaysa b'tchilas hashita. Instead, make sure you hit the return button, and you go to the next line and write it on the next line. So what do we have over here so far? Over here in the Gemara in Menachos, what we have very clearly in the words of the Gemara are 2 halachas. One, if you have a 5-letter word, do not write 2 letters within the margin and then 3 letters outside of the margin. Rather, what should you do? You should make sure that you have 3 letters in the margin and 2 letters out of the margin. That's halacha number 1. Halacha number 2, if you have a 2-letter word, do not put the entire 2-letter word outside of the margin. Now here begins a very complex machlokes rishonim. The first question is on the first halach in the Gemara. The Gemara says, 5-letter word, don't write 2 letters in the margin and 3 letters out of the margin. Make sure you have 3 in the margin and 2 out of the margin. What are we supposed to hear from this halacha? Is it a question of roiv? Is it a question that the problem is if you write 2 in the margins and then 3 out of the margins, so now it comes out that you have roiv of the word outside of the margin? Is that the problem? Or is the problem specific to 3? Do not write, you have a 5-letter word, if you do 2 in the margin, you're going to have 3 out of the margin. Maybe the Gemara is telling us that you should never have 3 parshiyos outside of the margin. Then the next halacha is 2-letter word. Make sure that you don't write the entire word outside of the margin. You can't have 2 letters outside of the margin. But 1 inside of the margin, 1 outside of the margin, I guess would be okay. Then we have a Tosfos on the top of Lamed Amud Beis. Tosfos says, Shloisha b'seich hadaf u'beis chutz ladaf. Omer Rabbeinu Tam, the shame, when it comes to the shame Hashem, tzarich sheyehi kuloi b'seich hadaf. The shame Hashem, the entire shame, has to be within the margin. You can't have any of the shame outside of the margin. So here we have the background. This gives us a little bit of background to this question of inside of the margin and outside of the margin. And against that backdrop, let me just read to you again. You know what? Let's read Sif Yud Gimel again. Yasa Shurai Shavais. We should make sure that the lines, left margin, right margin, they should be even. Shaloi Tayachas Nichneses Vachas Yoitzeis. We don't want to have the lines uneven so that one line goes in, one line goes out. Ulapachus, and at least Yizar, we should take care Shaloyichtov Shaloish Oisiyos Chutz Lashita, that we should not write 3 letters outside of the line. And the Beragoyla brings this down from the Smak and the Agos Maimoni, and it's based on this Gemara in Menachos. Because the Gemara said in Menachos, if you have a 5-letter word, don't do 2 in the margin and 3 out of the margin. So that's why the Mechaber says, Ulapachas, at least, Yizar, you should take care, that you shouldn't have 3 letters going outside of the line. Because the Gemara seems to say 3 letters outside of the line is bad. But if you did write 3 letters outside of the line, like puzzle, it's not going to be puzzle. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut and kuf mem zayin. V'achas yoitzeis, the line should be even, not 1 in and 1 going out. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'afilo oisachas. We really, lechatchila, we don't want the lines to be offset even by 1 letter. We want it to be nice and even. Why? Bishum zeh keli v'anveyu. This is an inyan of hidur. This is an inyan of hisnoya l'fanav b'mitzvahs. We all know, you look at a beautifully written mezuzah, it's a nice, evenly justified square. It looks beautiful. So that's what we want, l'chatchila. Ois katan kuf memches. The Mechaber said, l'pachus. At least we should make sure that we don't have 3 letters outside of the line. Says the Mishnah Berurah, midaloi chilek. Since we don't find the Mechaber making any distinctions here, mashma, the implication is, da'afilu im elu ha'shalosh ha'oisiyos he'miot ha'teva. Even if we're dealing only with a 4-letter word. I'm sorry, even if we're dealing with a 7-letter word. Even if we're dealing with a 7-letter word, so now it's 4 letters inside the margin and 3 letters outside of the margin, usr. It's still usr. Now you see here, the diuk that the Mishnah Berurah is making is based on the question that I brought up in the Gemara in Menachos. The Gemara in Menachos says, if you have a 5-letter word, you should not do 2 inside and 3 outside. Is that because 3 is roiv? Or is that because we can't have 3 letters outside the line? Says the Mishnah Berurah over here, what does the Mechaber say? The Mechaber says, do not make 3 letters outside of the margin. Does the Mechaber say that that's only true by a 5-letter word where 3 is roiv? No. He says, don't have 3 letters outside of the margin. So the implication is, even if it's a 7-letter word, so that you have roiv inside, you've got 4 inside the margin and 3 outside, that's still no good. You should never have 3 parshiyos outside the line. And that is one shita in the Rishonim. So again, the Mishnah Berurah said here in Kuf Mem Ches, Midoloi Chilek, since you don't find that the Mechaber differentiates between the size of the word, mashma, the implication is ta'afilu emelu ha'shalosh parshiyos, even if the 3 letters that are hanging outside of the margin, hey miot hateva, are only a minority of the letters, because it's, let's say, a 7-letter word, usr, it's still usr. Ubiyaridea Siman Reish Ayin Gimel Siv Daled Pasaka Rambam. We find that in Hilchos Sefer Torah the Mechaber Paskins like the Rambam. Deloy Kaptinan, where the Rambam wasn't makbid Elo Shelo Yichtov Roiv Hateva Chutz L'Shita. The Shitas Rambam is that it's only a problem to have roiv of the letters outside of the margin, and that's the way the Mechaber seems to paskin in Hilchos Sefer Torah. If you have Ateva Bashmoina Oisiyos, and if you have an 8-letter word, Mutter Lichtav Hachetzia Chutz L'Shita, you can even write 4 letters outside of the line. That's the way the Mechaber paskins in Hilchos Sefer Torah. Vayin b'shach sham shakasav, with a shach right sheyesh lahachmir kahach tahacha, that even by a Sefer Torah we should be machmir like the psak of the Mechaber here, that we should never have 3 letters outside of the line. Vayin bel yerabah shadaitoi dal kolpanim b'tfillin, that at least by tefillin shahal gilyonos kitzarim, where typically the margins, the size of the cloth outside of the columns is small, yesh lahachmir, we should be machmir. If we did write letters outside of the margin, whether we're speaking about writing outside of the margin at the beginning of the line, or at the end of the line, it's not going to be puzzle. Even if we wrote an entire word outside of the margin, it is still not puzzle. As long as it is visually recognizable that this word that's outside of the line belongs to the line that comes before it, and not that it belongs to the writing of the next column. Let's envision a shalyad. When you write a shalyad is a long parsha, and it has many amudim. Now, if you write a word outside of the line, if that word is too close to the next column, it might look like it belongs to a line of the next amud. So we have to make sure that it's visually recognizable that this word that's outside the margin is a continuation of the line on the previous amud, not that it's the first word of the line on the next amud. Okay, now we go to Sif Lamed Daled. Says the Mechaber, Shtei oisiyos shehem teva achas. Let's say we have 2 letters that are one word. The word shel, the word loy. Loy yichtov chutz l'shita. We should not write that entire word outside of the margin. That's basically a direct quote from the Gemara in Menachos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Kuf Nun Aleph Teva Achas, if you have one word. If you have Teva hi bas shalosh, let's say you have a 3-letter word. Mutter lichtov mimenu shtei oisiyos chutz l'shita. B'diavad, you could write 2 of the letters outside of the line, because it's less than 3 letters. Av shehem roiv ateva, even though it's the majority of the word. Yeridea Siman Reish Ayin Gimel Siv Gimel. V'ayin b'bir halacha dibra maschil teva, and if we look at that bir halacha dibra maschil teva achas, he says ayin b'Mishnah Berurah kein kasav arosh b'halachas ketanois upasak b'yeridea kavasei. V'ayin b'magen Avram b'siv katan memvav shekasav daf Rambam moida b'zeh lakil. Even the Rambam would be maskim. V'agra b'biurei kasav sheladas Rambam also b'zeh. However, the Gra writes that the Rambam would not like this, so there's definitely room to be machmir. Now we go to Sif Lamed Hey. If you remember, I brought down the Tosfos, Lamed Amud Beis, in Menachos. Tosfos says that the Shem Hashem has to be written completely within the margin. Says the Mechaber, Lamed Hey, Oisiyos Hashem, the letters of the Shem Hashem, Tzarech shiyu kulam b'soich hadaf, they have to be written, all of the letters must be written within the column, within the margins. And none of the letters of the Shem should extend outside of the margins. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Kuf Nun Beis, Oisiyos Hashem, the letters of the Shem, Afilu Shar Shemos She'enam Nimchakin. We are referring to all of the names of Hashem that may not be erased. So this is not only the Shem Havaya Yudke Vavke, this is also the Shem Kael, Aleph Lamed, the Shem Adnus, Aleph Daled Nun Yud, the Shem Shakai, Shin Daled Yud, the Shem Tzavakos. All of these names of Hashem are Shemesh Edom Nimchakin, and if they would appear in Tefillin, Elikim, Elika, they all have to be written completely within the margins. Ois Katan Kuf Nun Gimel. They all must be written within the margins. Hamagan Avram B'Shem Agayin Mareinu Arav Rabbi Yitzchak B'Poizna. It's brought down. The Magen Avram quotes the Rabbi Yitzchak B'Poizna. V'cheina Oila Shabbos V'el Yerabba V'kama Me'achrayim Asik T'dafka L'chatchila. They say that this halacha is only a requirement l'chatchila. L'chatchila, the oisiyos of the shame must all be within the margins. Ava b'di'eved and lahachmir, but b'di'eved, if some of the letters of the shame ended up outside of the margins, we do not have to be machmir. When we come nevertheless, im erikain b'sefer Torah, the Magen Avram says that if this did occur in a sefer Torah, where letters of the shame came out, extended beyond the margin, Hoira, he paskined to do a very interesting eitzah. Now, the backdrop of this eitzah, we have to remember that a Sefer Torah, it does not have to be written kisidron. It doesn't have to be written in order like Tefillin or mezuzahs. And therefore, you could do the following eitzah. You have a line now where the shame is written extending outside of the margin. Hoira, he paskined the Magen Avram, lichmchaik kol hashurais ha'elyonos, erase all of the lines above that line. Im ein behem shum shem mishem she'enam nimchakin, as long as those lines can be erased because they do not contain the name of Hashem. V'limshoich oisam, and then rewrite them and extend them sheyu shavos im Hashem, so that those lines will now be justified together with the line that has Hashem's name, where you extended and you went outside of the margins. Because since there is a way to fix it, loy mikri di'eved. We said b'di'eved it's okay. But b'di'eved means you could leave it that way if there's no way to fix it. But if there is a way to fix it, you should fix it. And by a Sefer Torah, there's a way to fix it. But if there's a shame in one of the lines above, or if we're dealing with a tefillin or mezuzah, the ef shalimchayk, where we can't erase what came before the name of Hashem that we already wrote. Mishum shaloi kisidron, because if we erase it, we rewrite it, the mezuzah or the tefillin are going to be possible because of the psul of shaloi kisidron, then kosher kach b'li tikun, then it's kosher without fixing it, even though you have the shem Hashem that is extending beyond the margin. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, v'yesh machmirin afilu b'di'eved, there are those who are machmir even b'di'eved, and say if the Shem Hashem continues outside of the margin, it is a problem. V'hiskim yimayim agoyin Rabbi Akiva Eger v'aderech Chaim, we find that Rabbi Akiva is machmir, the Sefer Derech Chaim is machmir. However, there is still an eitzah, even by tefillin and even by mezuzah, there is a possible eitzah to fix this. Now again, just understand what we're saying. What happened is you wrote, let's say, one line, and then you ended the line at the margin. Then you wrote the next line, and that line ends with the Shem Hashem, and the Shem Hashem extended outside of the margin. We're saying now that according to Rabbi Akiva Eger, we should be machmir even b'di'eved. So is there a way to save this parsha? Now remember, we can't erase the line before it and rewrite it and have it go the full size of the next line and make it justified with the Shem of Hashem, because then the tefillin would be written shaloi kisidron. So is there any other eitzah that we could employ? Says the Mishnah Berurah, yes, there is. In bashuros ha'elyonos, if on the lines above, where you now wrote the shame and went beyond the margin, ois ha'achrain, if the last letter on those lines is a beis, or a dalid, or a reish, the chadaima, or other such letters, sheyachal lemashchan, where you could extend them, right? If the last letter on the line above is a reish, you could just extend the gag of the reish and make it justified with the name of Hashem in the line below. And that's not shaloi kisidron, because the reish was already there. You're not writing the reish now. The reish is already written. You're just extending the gag. The same thing with a beis, the same thing with a chaf. You could extend those letters and thereby make the upper lines longer and justify them with the end of the name of Hashem that you wrote outside of the margin. Then kuluhu moidu debein b'sefer Torah bein b'tefillin u'mezuzos. Everybody would agree that in that case, if you have that eitzah, then whether you're dealing with a Sefer Torah or tefillin or mezuzos, Yimshay chaysan, stretch out those letters, Kidei shiyu shavais ima ois me'ashem sheyotza chutz l'shita, so as to justify those lines with the letters of the shame that went outside of the line. Ve'ein bazeh mishum shaloikis hidron, and then there would be no psul of shaloikis hidron. V'chein, and similarly, im loy kasav oid rak shura achas. Let's say you only wrote one line in the column so far. Ubishura shnia, and it's now on the second line of the column where you have a problem that the last word on the line is the shame and it went outside of the margin. Ubishura shnia mashach Hashem chutz l'shita. Yasa sirtutim acherim. Set new margins. We do a sirtut. We engrave a line into the cloth to make the margin. So you wrote one line within the margin. Then you wrote the second line and you ended it with the Shem Hashem and you went outside of the margin. Says the Mishnah, you know what you should do now? Make new margins. Make a new sirtut, set a new margin, v'yim shechem, and then extend all of the rest of the lines, sheyu arukim atzeif Hashem, so that they should be justified with the end of the second line that ended with the Shem Hashem. What are you going to do about the first line? The first line still ended earlier. We're not going to worry about one line. And you should know furthermore, says the Chavetz Chaim, if you have prefixes or suffixes to the shame, then b'di'evid we certainly don't have to worry if those letters went outside of the margin. So let's say you have La Hashem. So the limud is a prefix. If the limud is sticking out before the beginning of the line, we don't have to worry. Eloi kecha, right? The chaf, Eloi kecha, your God, Eloi kecha, the chaf is a suffix. So if the suffix extends outside of the line, b'di'evid, we certainly don't have to be makpid. Ois cotton kuf nun dalid. The Mechaber said that when it comes to the Shem Hashem, v'lo yoytze bihem klal chutz ladaf. No letters, not even one. Right? Previously we said that you shouldn't have 3 letters going outside the margin. Less than 3 letters, we said is okay. It's not zekeli van veyu, but it's okay. But when it comes to the Shem Hashem, not even 1 letter should go out of the margin. Kuftun dalet, mehem klal, afilu ois achas. The efsher, the afrubai kekuloi. Not only do we say that not even 1 letter should go outside of the margin, maybe not even roiv of 1 letter, because rubai kekuloi. Ava miktasa ois, but if it's a minor portion of the letter, less lan ba, that we don't have to worry about. Vim yatsa Hashem kuloi chutz legilyon ha'amud. Let's say the entire shame went outside of the margin. Kasher b'di'evid. Ve'ein adayim eliyotzei ois echad chutz l'shita, and it's not the same as if 1 letter goes outside of the line. The masha yotzei l'chutz hu chashav ketliya, where we say that, you see, okay, this is another halacha that the Mishnah Berurah doesn't give us any backdrop to. We know that people, when they're writing, especially in English, sometimes somebody writes a word, right? I'm going to write like this. I'm going to write the word hello. But I skipped the E. Oh my gosh, I skipped the E. I wrote hello without an E. So what do? You put an E on top of the line, and you make it what's called a caret. Right? You make a little arrow pointing up. Let's get it closer to the camera so you can see it. You have H, and then you have the E up on top, and then you have LLO. And you have the little caret that indicates insert the letter above. That, in halacha, is called tliya. That's called hanging a letter. You're hanging a letter above the line. Now, it happens to be that it's also considered tliya when letters extend at the end of the line, is also called tliya. Now, the halacha we find by the shame is that by the Shem Hashem, you're not allowed to use tliya. You're not allowed to insert a letter above the shame. And you can't use tliya even oisakas, even 1 letter. So what the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here is, in Ois Katan Kuf Nun Daled, let's read it again from the beginning against the backdrop of what I just told you. Mehem klal, the Mechaber said that not even 1 letter of the shame should extend outside of the line. Afilu oisakas, ve'eshad afru bekekuloi, ava miktas ois leslamba, ve'em yatsa Hashem kuloi chutz legilyon ha'amud. Now let's say the entire shame went outside of the line, kosher b'di'evid. The Mishnah Berurah says over here it's kosher b'di'evid. Ve'enoi doime liyotzei ois echad chutz lishita, and that's not the same as if only one letter was going outside the line. The mashi yotzei lechutz hu chashuv kitliya, because if you have, let's say Yud Kei Vav Kei, if the Yud Hey Vav are inside the margin, and then the last Hey is outside the margin, that's called Tliya. That's like doing the Yud, the Hey, and then the Vav on top of the line, and then the Hey. One letter outside of the line is called Tliya, and we can't have Tliya by the Shem. But if the entire Shem is written outside the letter, then it's not called Tliya in the Shem, because the entire Shem is written on one level and is written one way outside the margin. If you have part of it inside the margin and part of it outside of the margin, so then the part outside is considered Tliya, and we can't have Tliya by the Shem. But if the entire Shem is outside of the margin, then that's not Tliya, and then it's not puzzle. That's what the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here. He says, if the entire Shem is chutz legilyon amud, kasher b'di'evet, and that's actually better, it's a little counterintuitive, that's better than if you would only have one letter of the Shem outside of the line, outside of the margin. Why? Because if you have only one letter outside of the margin, then that one letter is considered Tliya, and we can't have Tliya by the Shem. The Karmelon b'yaredei reishayin vav sivav demixas hashem ain't toilen, that we can't be toila a letter of the Shem. Masha ain't ken bazeh, but over here, if you have the entire word outside the margin, then there's no Tliya. Kain kasav abnei yoina, but v'agoyin Rabbi Akiva Eiger b'chidusha b'siman zeh makbir gam bazeh. Rabbi Akiva Eiger passes even if you have the whole Shem outside the margin, ayin sham, and he says it's because this halakha has nothing to do with Tliya. Rabbi Akiva Eiger says the problem of having part of the Shem outside of the line has nothing to do with Tliya. It's an independent halakha. And we're going to stop over here. We'll continue next time with Sif Lam and Vav. Thank you for joining me for limud HaTorah. This list of limud HaTorah should be banging against Klal Yisrael. The Baruch Hashem should send Yeshua Sefuras Parnasit Shetruchim to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the Bias Kol Tzedek. B'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.